The autumn wind cut through the valleys of West Virginia like a knife, rattling the shutters of the small houses that dotted Route 219 north of Marlinton. October had always been the hardest month for Rebecca Winters, when the leaves turned gold and crimson, just like they had 12 years ago when her daughter vanished without a trace. Lily Winters had been 14 years old when she disappeared during a routine family camping trip in the Monongahela National Forest, leaving behind nothing but a half-eaten granola bar and her hiking boots arranged neatly beside the tent. The search had consumed 3 counties, involved over 800 volunteers, and made headlines across the region for 6 straight months. But the mountains kept their secrets, and eventually the searchers went home, the reporters stopped calling, and Rebecca was left alone with her grief and unanswered questions. If you're watching this story unfold and want to hear more mysteries like this one, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. The call came on a Thursday evening in late October, 12 years and 43 days after Lily had vanished. Rebecca was washing dishes in the kitchen of the same house where she'd raised her daughter, the same house she'd refused to leave, despite her ex-husband's pleading that they start fresh somewhere else. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Dale Hutchins of Pocahontas County, the same man who had coordinated the original search and had called her every year on the anniversary with nothing new to report. But this time, his voice carried a tremor that made Rebecca's hands shake so badly she nearly dropped the phone. A young woman had walked out of the forest near Droop Mountain, he said, claiming to be Lily Winters. She was barefoot, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been fashioned from animal skins and woven plant fibers, and she insisted she didn't need to sleep anymore, hadn't needed to for years. Rebecca didn't remember hanging up the phone or grabbing her keys, only the feeling of gravel spraying beneath her tires as she drove the 47 miles to the county hospital in Elkins faster than she'd ever driven in her life. The young woman sitting in the hospital bed looked both exactly like Lily and nothing like her at all. She had the same auburn hair, now long and tangled with bits of leaves still caught in it, the same pale green eyes that Rebecca saw in the mirror every morning. But her skin was weathered in a way that spoke of years exposed to sun and wind, her hands calloused and scarred, her body lean with muscle. When she looked up and saw Rebecca in the doorway, she smiled with a mixture of joy and something else, something distant and unknowable. Rebecca crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her into an embrace, sobbing into her daughter's hair while Lily patted her back with an awkward gentleness, as if she'd forgotten how human comfort worked. The doctors had already examined her and found her physically healthy, despite obvious malnutrition and exposure. But it was her neurological readings that had them baffled. The EEG showed unusual brain activity patterns, and when they'd monitored her overnight, she never entered any sleep cycle at all. She simply lay there with her eyes open, breathing steadily, her mind somehow resting without ever losing consciousness. Dr. Patricia Huang, the neurologist who'd been called in from Charleston, stood at the foot of the bed with Lily's chart and admitted she'd never seen anything quite like it in 23 years of practice. Over the following days, as Lily submitted to test after test and interview after interview with law enforcement officials, a fragmentary story began to emerge. She remembered the camping trip, remembered wandering away from the campsite because she'd heard what sounded like a child crying deeper in the woods. She remembered following the sound until she became disoriented, the familiar trail markers disappearing as fog rolled through the valleys. She'd tried to retrace her steps, but everything looked the same, endless trees and rocky outcroppings that all blurred together. As night fell and the temperature dropped, she'd found a shallow cave and huddled inside, terrified and calling for her parents until her voice went hoarse. What happened after that grew hazier in her memory, like trying to recall a dream years later. She remembered being cold, so cold she thought she might die, and then a strange warmth spreading through her body, starting at the base of her skull and radiating outward. She remembered her exhaustion lifting, replaced by a clarity and alertness that felt almost painful in its intensity. And she remembered realizing, as dawn broke over the mountains, that she wasn't tired anymore, wasn't sleepy, didn't need to close her eyes or rest. The hunger for sleep that had governed her entire young life had simply vanished, as if someone had flipped a switch in her brain. The FBI became involved when inconsistencies in Lily's story raised questions about whether she'd been held captive or if there were others involved in her disappearance. Special Agent Vernon Brooks, a specialist in missing persons cases who'd worked the original investigation, flew in from the Pittsburgh field office with a team of forensic specialists. They combed through every word of Lily's interviews, searching for signs of coaching or deception, but the polygraph tests came back inconclusive. Not because she was lying, the examiner explained, but because her physiological responses didn't follow normal patterns. Her heart rate barely fluctuated, her skin conductivity remained steady, and the breathing variations that typically indicated stress or dishonesty simply weren't present. It was as if her body had achieved some kind of baseline equilibrium that normal humans never reached. Meanwhile, search teams returned to the area where Lily claimed to have survived, focusing on a remote section of the Monongahela National Forest, about 18 miles from where she'd originally disappeared. They found evidence of long-term habitation in several caves and rock shelters, fire pits with charred rabbit bones, crude tools fashioned from stone and wood, woven grass mats that might have served as bedding. Forensic analysis would later confirm that some of the organic materials dated back approximately 12 years, supporting Lily's claim that she'd survived alone in the wilderness all this time. What the investigators struggled to explain was how a 14-year-old girl with minimal survival training had managed to stay alive through 12 brutal Appalachian winters, or why she would choose to remain in the forest rather than finding her way back to civilization. Lily's answers were frustratingly vague, almost philosophical. She talked about learning to read the forest, to understand the patterns of animal behavior and seasonal changes. She described entering a state of heightened awareness where sleep became unnecessary, where her mind could process information continuously without the need for rest. She claimed the first few months had been desperate and terrifying, filled with near starvation and dangerous encounters with black bears and coyotes, but that gradually she'd adapted in ways she couldn't fully explain. The not sleeping gave her an advantage, she said. She could forage and hunt at night when other predators were less active, could maintain fires and keep watch without ever letting her guard down. The doctors who examined her found this explanation deeply troubling because medically it shouldn't have been possible. Human beings require sleep for basic cellular repair, memory consolidation, and hormonal regulation. The longest documented case of voluntary sleeplessness was 11 days, after which the subject experienced severe cognitive impairment. Yet Lily showed no signs of the deterioration that should have accompanied 12 years without sleep. If anything, her cognitive function tested above average, her memory sharp and detailed, her problem-solving skills remarkably advanced. Rebecca tried to adjust to having her daughter back, but it was like living with a beautiful stranger who wore Lily's face. The girl who came home didn't remember how to use a smartphone or what movies she'd loved before disappearing. She spent hours sitting perfectly still by the window, watching the tree line with an intensity that made Rebecca's skin crawl. She never ate processed food, claiming it made her feel sick, and would only consume things she'd prepared herself from raw ingredients. And she never, ever slept. Rebecca would wake at 3 in the morning to find Lily sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like an animal's, or standing in the backyard in her bare feet, regardless of how cold it was. The neighbors began to talk, whispers spreading through the small community about Rebecca Winter's daughter who'd come back wrong, who'd spent so long in the wild that she'd forgotten how to be human. The attention became suffocating, reporters camping outside their house, true crime podcasters calling at all hours, conspiracy theorists on the internet weaving elaborate stories about government experiments and alien abductions. Rebecca's sister Angela flew in from Pittsburgh to help manage the chaos, and it was Angela who first suggested that maybe Lily needed more specialized help than the local doctors could provide. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after Lily's return, when Dr. Huang arranged for her to be evaluated at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. The research team there included specialists in sleep medicine, neurology, genetics, and evolutionary biology, all fascinated by this unprecedented case. Over 3 weeks of intensive testing, they discovered that Lily's brain chemistry had undergone dramatic changes. The neurons in her hypothalamus, the region responsible for regulating sleep-wake cycles, showed unusual structural modifications. Her levels of hypocretin, the neurotransmitter that promotes wakefulness, were significantly elevated compared to normal baseline levels, while her adenosine receptors, which typically build up sleep pressure throughout the day, appeared to have been fundamentally altered. Most remarkably, her glymphatic system, which in normal humans only activates during sleep to clear metabolic waste from the brain, seemed to function continuously. The lead researcher, Dr. Kenneth Ossie, theorized that whatever had happened to Lily in those mountains had triggered an extremely rare, adaptive response, possibly related to severe hypothermia or some other environmental stressor that had fundamentally rewired her neurological architecture. He compared it to cases of extreme trauma causing permanent psychological changes, except in Lily's case, the changes were physiological and appeared to have enhanced rather than damaged her functioning. While the medical community debated the implications of Lily's condition and several research institutions offered substantial funding to study her long-term, Rebecca faced a more immediate concern about her daughter's psychological state. Lily had grown increasingly restless in the confined hospital environment, pacing the hallways at all hours, standing at windows and staring toward the west with an expression of profound longing. When Rebecca finally asked her what was wrong, Lily's answer chilled her to the bone. She didn't belong in this world anymore, she said. She'd spent 12 years learning a different way of existing, and now the noise and light and constant stimulation of modern life felt like torture. The smell of exhaust made her nauseous. The hum of electricity gave her headaches, and the presence of so many people in such close proximity created an anxiety she couldn't escape because she could never sleep to find relief from it. Most disturbing was what she said about the mountains. She could feel them calling her, she insisted, the same way migrating birds feel magnetic north. The forest had changed her into something that could survive there, but that meant she could no longer survive here, among the people and places she'd once called home. The final confrontation happened on a cold November morning, 2 months and 4 days after Lily's return. Rebecca woke to find her daughter's bedroom window open and the hand-sewn clothes she'd been wearing when she emerged from the forest, missing from the closet where they'd been stored as evidence. She called Sheriff Hutchins, who organized another search, this one smaller and more resigned than the massive effort 12 years prior. They found Lily 3 days later, 34 miles into the national forest, living in a makeshift shelter she'd constructed with remarkable efficiency. She wasn't hiding from them, didn't run when the search team approached. She simply explained, with the patient tone of someone speaking to a child, that this was where she needed to be. She'd tried to come back, tried to be the daughter Rebecca remembered, but that girl had died in the mountains 12 years ago. What had walked out of the forest was something different, something adapted to a life Rebecca could never understand. Agent Brooks attempted to argue that she needed supervision, that her condition required ongoing medical monitoring, but Lily pointed out that she was now 26 years old and legally free to make her own choices. Dr. Wang, who'd accompanied the search team, reluctantly agreed that forcing Lily into treatment against her will would likely cause more harm than good. Rebecca made peace with her daughter's decision in stages, each one breaking her heart a little more, but also bringing a strange relief. She visited Lily in the forest twice a month, hiking to the general area where her daughter had established a territory and waiting at a designated spot until Lily appeared. They would talk for hours, Rebecca bringing news from town and supplies that Lily accepted with bemused tolerance, even though it was clear she didn't really need them. Lily would share observations about the forest, about the black bears preparing for hibernation and the migration patterns of birds, speaking with the authority of someone who'd become part of the ecosystem rather than just a visitor to it. She never seemed to age in quite the same way other people did, Rebecca noticed. After 2 years, then 5, then 10, Lily looked perhaps a few years older, but nowhere near what she should have. The lack of sleep that should have destroyed her seemed instead to have preserved her in some fundamental way, as if by escaping one of the most basic requirements of human biology, she'd also escaped some of its limitations. The scientific papers about Lily's case, published under the pseudonym Subject LW to protect her privacy, revolutionized understanding of sleep neurology and human adaptation. Dr. Osei's research team proposed that Lily represented a potential evolutionary pathway that humans might have taken under different environmental pressures, a proof of concept that the brain's architecture could be radically reorganized in response to extreme stress. Other researchers were more cautious, suggesting that her case was too unique and poorly documented to draw broad conclusions from, that there might be genetic factors or previous conditions that predisposed her to this transformation. The debate played out in medical journals and academic conferences, with Lily's case becoming a touchstone for discussions about consciousness, the purpose of sleep, and the limits of human adaptability. None of the researchers could interview Lily directly anymore since she'd returned to the forest, which frustrated them to no end, but which Rebecca found oddly satisfying. Her daughter had become something remarkable, something that couldn't be categorized or controlled, and there was a fierce pride in that. Angela eventually moved to West Virginia to be closer to her sister, recognizing that Rebecca needed support to cope with the profound strangeness of her situation. Together, they established a routine around the bi-monthly visits, Angela often accompanying Rebecca on the hikes and developing her own relationship with this woman who was technically her niece, but felt more like a force of nature. Angela was the one who suggested they document Lily's story properly, not for the tabloids or the researchers, but for the family, for some future generation who might want to understand what had happened. Rebecca initially resisted, not wanting to exploit her daughter's tragedy, but Lily herself approved of the idea during one of their forest meetings. She wanted people to know, she said, that there were other ways of existing in the world, that human beings were more adaptable and stranger than most people believed. She wanted her story to be a question mark rather than a cautionary tale, an invitation to wonder about the paths not taken and the versions of ourselves we might become under different circumstances. Sheriff Hutchins retired after 31 years of service, and at his retirement party he told Rebecca that her daughter's case had been the defining mystery of his career. Not just because of the disappearance and miraculous return, but because of what it represented about the wild places that still existed in America, the pockets of genuine wilderness where the rules of civilization didn't fully apply. The Appalachian Mountains had been home to humans for thousands of years, he reminded her, and those humans had adapted to the harsh terrain in ways that modern people had largely forgotten. Maybe what happened to Lily was just an extreme version of that adaptation, a reminder that we were still animals capable of surviving in ways our comfortable modern lives had made us forget. Rebecca appreciated his perspective, even if it didn't fully ease her grief for the normal life her daughter would never have. She'd lost Lily twice, once to the mountains and once to the choice to return to them. But in another sense, she'd never really lost her at all, because twice a month she got to sit with her daughter and hear her laugh and see the contentment in her eyes that came from living exactly as she was meant to live. The question of what exactly had happened to Lily during those first few days in the wilderness, what had triggered the neurological changes that eliminated her need for sleep, remained unanswered despite years of investigation and speculation. Some researchers believed it was related to severe hypothermia, that Lily's brain had been pushed to the brink of death and in protecting itself had activated dormant genetic pathways that altered her sleep architecture. Others suggested it might have been a rare prion disease or viral infection that, instead of causing the devastating effects typically associated with such conditions, had triggered beneficial mutations. A few outliers proposed that Lily had discovered some natural substance in the forest, perhaps a plant or fungus with psychoactive properties, that had permanently altered her brain chemistry. Lily herself couldn't or wouldn't provide clarity, insisting that she didn't remember the specifics of those early days, only that she'd been dying and then somehow hadn't been dying anymore, and the sleep had left her in the process. The mystery became part of her legend in the region, the girl who'd survived 12 years in the Appalachian wilderness without ever closing her eyes. Dr. Huang continued to monitor Lily's condition remotely, analyzing blood and tissue samples that Rebecca collected during their visits and brought back to the lab for analysis. The data consistently showed that Lily's unique neurological state remained stable, neither improving nor deteriorating, but simply persisting as a new baseline for her physiology. Brain scans revealed that the unusual structures in her hypothalamus had not only remained, but had become more pronounced over time, suggesting that her body had fully integrated and optimized whatever changes had occurred. Her telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that typically shorten with age, showed less degradation than would be expected for someone her age, leading to speculation that the lack of sleep might be affecting her cellular aging processes. Dr. Huang published a follow-up paper suggesting that if sleep's primary function was cellular repair and maintenance, then Lily's continuously functioning glymphatic system might be providing those benefits without the need for the unconscious state that normally accompanied them. The implications were staggering. If the mechanism could be understood and safely replicated, it could revolutionize treatment for sleep disorders and potentially extend human lifespan and productivity. But for Rebecca, all the scientific speculation and medical breakthrough talk missed the essential emotional truth of the situation. Her daughter had been taken from her by circumstances beyond anyone's control, had survived against impossible odds through some combination of will and biological adaptation, and had ultimately chosen a life that meant they could never truly be together again. It was a grief without closure, a loss that persisted even as Lily remained physically present in the world, living her strange existence in the mountains less than 20 miles from the house where she'd grown up. Rebecca learned to carry that grief the way one carries any chronic condition, with good days and bad days, with moments of acceptance and moments of overwhelming sorrow. Angela helped, and so did the small community of people who'd known and loved Lily before her disappearance, who understood that Rebecca was navigating an unprecedented situation with no roadmap or support group for parents whose children had been fundamentally changed by trauma. The media attention eventually faded as new mysteries and tragedies captured public interest, which came as a relief to everyone involved. Lily became a local legend, a story that parents in Pocahontas County told their children when they wanted to emphasize the importance of staying on marked trails during hikes. Though the story usually got distorted in the telling until it bore little resemblance to the actual events, Rebecca stopped correcting people's misconceptions, recognizing that the truth was stranger than any folklore and that most people wouldn't believe it anyway. She focused instead on maintaining her connection with her daughter, on treasuring those twice-monthly visits where they could sit together and talk, where Lily would sometimes rest her head on Rebecca's shoulder with a tenderness that proved she hadn't forgotten love, even if she'd forgotten how to need sleep. Those moments made everything bearable, made it possible for Rebecca to go back to her ordinary life, knowing that her daughter was out there, wild and free and impossibly alive. Agent Brooks, now retired from the FBI, included Lily's case in a book he published about unusual missing persons investigations. He wrote about it with respect and restraint, focusing on the law enforcement and search aspects rather than the more sensational medical details. He'd stayed in touch with Rebecca over the years, calling every few months to check in, and she'd come to appreciate his perspective as someone who'd seen the case from the outside but had invested genuine care in its resolution. Brooks confessed to her once that Lily's case had changed how he thought about his work, had made him question the assumption that finding missing persons and returning them to their previous lives was always the best possible outcome. Sometimes people were changed by their experiences in ways that made return impossible, and in those cases the goal had to shift from restoration to acceptance. Rebecca thanked him for understanding what so many others couldn't, that having Lily back wasn't the happy ending she'd desperately wanted 12 years ago, but it was the ending they'd gotten, and there was value in learning to live with that. As Rebecca entered her 60s and felt the weight of years in her joints and the grey spreading through her hair, she became increasingly aware that she was aging in a way Lily no longer seemed to be. The daughter she visited in the forest looked perhaps 35, despite being biologically 41, her skin still smooth and her movement still fluid with the grace of someone in their prime. It created an uncanny reversal of the natural order, the mother growing old while the daughter remained mysteriously preserved, and Rebecca found herself wondering what would happen when she became too frail to make the hikes into the forest. Would Lily come to her then, or would their connection simply fade as Rebecca lost the physical ability to maintain it? She tried not to dwell on these morbid thoughts during their visits, instead focusing on the present moment, on the sound of her daughter's voice and the familiar features of her face, and the miracle of her continued existence, no matter how strange the form it took. Lily seemed to sense her mother's concerns without them being spoken aloud. And one autumn afternoon, as they sat together watching light filter through the changing leaves, she made a promise. When Rebecca could no longer come to the forest, Lily would come to her. She would remember how to navigate the human world long enough to sit with her mother in those final years or months or days, would hold her hand and tell her stories about the forest and make sure she didn't die alone. It was the most human thing Lily had said in years, proof that beneath the wild creature she'd become, there was still the girl who'd loved her mother. And Rebecca cried with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude so intense, it left her breathless. They sat together until dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, until the first stars emerged and the temperature dropped, and Rebecca finally had to head back while she could still see the trail. She looked back before the path curved out of sight and saw Lily standing motionless among the trees, her eyes reflecting the last light like an animal's, watching to make sure her mother made it safely home. The story of Lily Winters became, in the end, a story about adaptation and loss and the complicated ways people survive trauma. It was about a mother's love that persisted even when the object of that love transformed into something barely recognizable. About a daughter who found a way to live that no one else could understand, but which worked for her in ways that conventional existence never could. It was about the wild places that still existed in America, the forests and mountains that could still reshape human beings who ventured into them unprepared, and about the mysteries of human neurology and the possibilities locked within our biology that only emerge under the most extreme circumstances. Most of all, it was about acceptance. Rebecca learning to accept the daughter who returned to her, Lily accepting the changes that allowed her survival, and both of them accepting that love doesn't require understanding, only presence and persistence, and the willingness to meet each other in the spaces where their different worlds overlapped.